These lectures have already touched on international issues in a number of places. For example, we've talked about what's meant by the balance of trade. We've talked about the impact of international trade on competition within markets and how that affects antitrust policy. But the last 5 lectures of this course are going to focus almost exclusively on international economic issues. This lecture focuses on the arguments for free and unrestricted trade in goods and services, while the next lecture then lists arguments for restricting trade and gives a sense of how economists respond to those arguments. The following 2 lectures then focus on international movements of financial capital, with one lecture focused on exchange rates, and the following lecture focused on the question of when flows of financial capital across borders can cause financial crashes, as has happened in countries like Russia and Argentina in the last decade or so. Then the final lecture will give an overview of the shape of the global economy and some of the main macroeconomic issues that it faces. It's perhaps no surprise that to keep my economist union card, I need to be in favor of free trade, and I am in favor of free trade, but I will also readily admit that it's a complex situation with both costs and benefits. Let's start off with some basic perspective. How much globalization, to use the buzzword of the day, has occurred in recent decades? Let me give you a simple-minded answer, which is often, in my mind, a pretty good answer. Take a look at a statistic like exports as a share of GDP. That tells you what proportion of your economic output is being sold outside the country. If you used imports instead, it would say what proportion of what is consumed is being sold inside the country. You could use either one, truth be told. But in 1950, world exports were about 7% of world GDP. Now, world exports are about 25% of world GDP. So there's more than a tripling going on there. There's a similar pattern for the U.S. economy. In 1950, U.S. exports were about 3% of GDP. In the mid-2000s, exports are about 12% of GDP. So again, there's kind of a tripling or quadrupling going on there. When people talk about globalization, this is in essence the trend they're talking about, that of the stuff that is produced in an economy, a much larger share is now being sold across international borders than was before. Now, there are several reasons why international trade could be a win-win situation for all the countries that participate. Let's start off by focusing on the arguments of economists for why gains from trade exist. And I'm going to categorize these into 3 groups. One is absolute advantage, one is comparative advantage, and one I'm going to call dynamic gains over time. But we need to explore each of those, obviously, in a little more depth. So let's start off with the idea of absolute advantage. What's meant by that? One nation has an absolute advantage over another nation in the production of a certain good if it can make that good with higher productivity. Remember, productivity would be higher output per hour or somehow fewer inputs being needed to make that output. As an example, think about a world that just has 2 countries. Let's call them the United States and Saudi Arabia. And for a moment, let's just set aside all the issues about national security and oil dependence and everything else like that. Let's say, and this is plausible enough, that the United States has an absolute advantage over Saudi Arabia in growing wheat. We Americans don't sing about those amber waves of grain for nothing. Saudi Arabia has an absolute advantage on the other side in producing oil. Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of places where you can more or less put a sharp stick in the ground and oil will bubble up. Now, of course, Saudi Arabia does have some fertile areas where it can grow crops. But if Saudi Arabia tried to grow all of its own wheat, it's going to be quite costly to do so. It's just hard to grow wheat in the desert, even with irrigation. The United States, on the other side, does have some areas where oil is fairly cheap to drill. But if the U.S. economy tried to provide all of its own oil, it would be quite costly to do so. I mean, we're not talking about, going offshore, drilling straight down a couple of miles, drilling horizontally underground, using various technologies to push the oil out. So both sides can produce their desired output of wheat and oil at lower cost if they play to their absolute advantage and then trade with each other. The U.S. can produce lots and lots of wheat and trade it for oil. Saudi Arabia can produce lots and lots of oil and trade it for wheat. Both countries can be better off if they play to where they have their productivity advantage. I think for most people, that idea of trade is relatively intuitive, relatively straightforward. Just because growing wheat in the desert and trying to drill for all the U.S. oil offshore would be obviously so very costly. But now let's imagine the next case, and this is where it gets a little more difficult. A case where one country has an absolute productivity advantage in all areas, and the other country has an absolute disadvantage in all areas. Now, the mental example I sometimes use here, which isn't quite fair or quite accurate, but as a mental example, I'm using the U.S. and Mexico. There's a very, very wide range of goods and services where the U.S. has workers with a higher average level of education. The U.S. workers are working with better and newer capital equipment. The U.S. workers are supported by a better infrastructure of communications and electricity and transportation. And so there are just a lot of goods that U.S. workers can produce more productively than workers in Mexico could. Or if, for example, Mexico worries you to think about Mexico, think about Africa or China. U.S. workers are just extremely productive at making an awful lot of things. However, even in this situation, where one country is more productive in all goods than the other country, it is possible for trade between the two countries to benefit both of them. And this is a surprising and I think counterintuitive result that goes back to the early 19th century. Economists have been trying to explain it ever since. The fundamental idea here is the idea of comparative advantage. And here's what comparative advantage means. Comparative advantage exists when a nation has either a largest productivity advantage in producing a certain good or service compared to other nations, or if it doesn't have any area of productivity advantage, then it has a comparative advantage in where it has the smallest productivity disadvantage in producing a certain good or service. So to get comparative advantage, you need to think about all the possible things that a nation should do. And the theory of comparative advantage says, focus on those things where your productivity advantage is biggest, or if you don't have anything where it's biggest, focus on those areas where your productivity disadvantage is smallest. Now let me try and give you an intuitive feel for how this can benefit all parties. Now I've personally never had a secretary, but let's pretend I had a secretary. I like to pretend that sometimes. And let's say for the sake of argument, there are two main jobs I have to do. One is editing economics articles and the other is typing memos. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that I am faster at both jobs than my secretary is. I am faster at editing economics articles and I am faster at typing memos. So I have a productivity advantage in both areas. Does it follow then, in logic, that because I have a productivity advantage in both areas, I should do all the work of the office and my secretary should do nothing? Well, of course not. That would be just foolish. It would be foolish because the secretary's time wouldn't be being used at all. Presumably, my advantage at editing economics articles is much bigger. My advantage at typing is relatively smaller compared to my secretary. So I'm much better off hiring a secretary, focusing on the area where my productivity advantage is greatest, and letting my secretary focus on the productivity area where the secretary's productivity disadvantage is least. It would be silly for me to try and do everything. Similarly, another example. Should the great professional basketball player LeBron James mow his own lawn? Now, let's face it, this is a world-class athlete. He is probably much faster at mowing his lawn than anyone he can hire. He has a productivity advantage at mowing his lawn. But it would be crazy for him to spend his time that way, right? He should focus on the area of playing professional basketball and doing endorsements where he has an extraordinary productivity advantage. And then he should hire other people to do other jobs, even if he would still have a productivity advantage in those areas. And it benefits both parties for him to hire those people and for those people to have trade and exchange. Third example. My father was in the Boy Scouts. I think he was even an Eagle Scout. So when I was growing up and our family went camping, my dad was the best at everything involved in camping. He is the best at collecting firewood, he's best at making a fire, he's best at cooking, he's best at putting up tents, he's best at everything. He has a productivity advantage in all aspects of camping. So, question, should Dad do absolutely all of the work while the rest of us sit around and watch him? Is that better for everyone if we do that? Well, of course not. I mean, Dad can't do everything, he's going to run out of time. It's going to be better for everyone if my father focuses on the skills where his productivity advantage is biggest, and where the rest of us focus on the skills where our productivity disadvantage is smallest. And when we combine those productivity advantages and productivity disadvantages, certainly my father will be better off getting help, and in fact we'll all be better off because a great deal more is going to get done, and get done more easily than if one person tries to do everything. So with those sorts of intuitive ideas in mind, let's now retreat to my example of the United States and Mexico. Let's say that the United States is better at producing computers in the sense that it has higher productivity, and it's better at producing textiles than Mexico is, again in the sense that the US has higher productivity. Does it therefore follow that the United States should produce both all of its computers and all of its textiles and have no trade with Mexico in either area? Well, no, for just the same reason. The US should focus on the area where its productivity advantage is greatest, which is presumably computers in this little hypothetical example, and Mexico should focus on an area where its productivity disadvantage is least, which would be textiles. The two can then trade with each other, and both nations can be better off. Both the nation with the productivity advantage in both goods and the nation with the productivity disadvantage in both goods can both benefit from trade. This is the remarkable theory of comparative advantage. The remarkable theory of comparative advantage establishes that even when one nation is more productive in all goods, both nations can still benefit from trade. If you're the nation with the productivity advantage in all goods, focus on those areas where your absolute advantage is greatest. If you're the nation with the disadvantage in all goods, focus on where your absolute productivity disadvantage is the least. Now, you sometimes hear someone who is economically illiterate say, but what about the nations that have no comparative advantage? What if nations just don't have any comparative advantage? Then they can't trade. And the reason I refer to this as illiterate is because even if you have lower productivity at absolutely everything, you still have a comparative advantage. You just need to find the area where your disadvantage is smallest. In effect, everyone has something they are least bad at. And that's what you should seek out and do, whatever you're least bad at. It's kind of inspiring in a weird sort of way that everyone fits into this picture. Now, both absolute and comparative advantage are issues about trade between countries with different productivity levels, selling really different products, computers, textiles, wheat, oil, really different products. However, well over half of world trade happens between countries that are really very similar. And I'm thinking particularly here of the high-income economies of the world in North America, in Europe, including Japan and Australia and New Zealand. Much of the trade between these countries involves buying and selling literally the same products. The U.S. imports cars from Europe and exports cars to Europe. Japan exports cars to the U.S. and does import some cars from the U.S. Countries are importing and exporting cars back and forth. They're importing and exporting machine tools back and forth. They're importing and exporting computers back and forth. A few years ago, when the statistics for Britain and France showed that cars were the biggest import for those economies and also the biggest export for those economies. So rather than buying and selling very different goods, they're really buying and selling the same goods. Moreover, the countries that are buying and selling have, in a big picture sense, very similar wages. I mean, they're all high-income countries. It's not like some are dreadfully poor like China or India. So why does this kind of trade exist? It's not obviously absolute advantage. It's not obviously comparative advantage. And a lot of the study of international trade since the 1970s and 1980s has focused on this kind of similar trade in the same goods between similar countries, and tried to figure out why that might be beneficial. Let me give you some of the possible reasons. One possible reason: trading similar goods allows even smaller countries to take advantage of economies of scale. Imagine, for example, that you're in the United Kingdom, which is a relatively small economy by world standards. If you have a whole bunch of little car companies in the United Kingdom, they're going to be quite small. They won't be able to take advantage of the fact that large car companies can produce at a lower average cost. They won't be able to take advantage of those economies of scale. So, what should you do? Well, if you have a couple of very, very large car plants in the United Kingdom, those can take advantage of economies of scale, and then they can sell back and forth with car plants in other countries that also are very large. And thus, even the smaller countries can take advantage of economies of scale and trade back and forth. A second advantage of this kind of trade: trading similar goods provides a gain of variety. You get many different kinds of cars. Again, if you're the United Kingdom, a relatively small economy, it might be that one big car plant provides essentially all the cars the United Kingdom really demands in a given year. But if you trade back and forth between other countries, then you can still have the economies of scale, but also have a much greater variety of possibilities within your market. A third advantage: trading similar goods allows a greater degree of specialization within industries. And the issue here is what's called breaking up the value chain, or sometimes the word disintermediation is used if you hear that. What they're referring to there is that when you're making a car, you break it up into lots of pieces. There are going to be low-tech pieces like the plastic for the seat covers. There are going to be higher-tech pieces like the computers in the engines. There's going to be assembly parts. And what can happen with trade between similar countries is that these parts all get divided up. Part of the car is made here, part of the car is made there, the parts are all shipped, they go back and forth across national borders, eventually they're assembled and sold someplace. This is sometimes called Smithian trade because it follows Adam Smith's idea of the gains from a greater division of labor that was discussed back in Lecture 2. If everyone can focus on these specific specialized tasks, they can be more productive in all the individual tasks. A fourth advantage: trade in similar goods can encourage a flow of knowledge and skills that will benefit both countries. Give you an example from the United States. The Japanese companies invented something called just-in-time inventory management, in which inventories were kept very, very low and things were only delivered to the factory as they were needed. It turns out that in a number of industries, that's a very, very effective way of organizing manufacturing. Well, the US learned that idea from Japan. There was a flow of ideas, not just of goods and services. Another famous example that I confess may or may not be true is that back in the 14th century, the great explorer Marco Polo went to China, and the legend has it that he brought back the idea of noodles, which eventually became the Italian pasta industry. He didn't bring back actual noodles, you understand. He brought back the idea of noodles, and that interchange of ideas can be extraordinarily powerful. A fifth advantage: trading similar goods across national borders provides greater competition for domestic producers, and thus better incentives for low prices and innovation. Now, all of these factors together help explain why trade between countries might benefit those countries even when it's the same goods and the same kinds of economies. And honestly, I suspect that these kinds of factors are probably much more important to the productivity gains from trade, maybe not much more important, but quite important compared to the basic absolute and comparative advantage arguments. But they're really hard to measure, these gains. And so economists are still struggling with trying to say, how would you measure the gains from the kinds of things I described? Moreover, the advantages of trading and who should benefit, what should be split up, where your comparative advantage lies, are bound to shift somewhat over time. As new products are developed, workers learn new skills, and so on. These shifts can also be a source of gains to an economy, since learning and competing in global markets provides pressure for productivity gains. So that's the theory of why there are gains from trade. What's the evidence? There's actually a strong empirical correlation between countries that expand trade and countries that have good economic growth. The circumstantial evidence here is extremely strong. If you look at time periods where trade is expanding, that tends to be when economies are expanding. A time when trade is contracting tend to be like the 1930s, when the economy is lousy. Countries with expanding trade tend to be countries with expanding economies. There are literally zero examples of countries that have gotten very rich without expanding trade. The World Bank published a study several years ago on this subject. They split the world economy into two groups. Group one was called globalizers. And in the globalizers were countries where the ratio of exports to GDP doubled in the 1980s and 1990s. So this would include, for example, China, India, Mexico, most of the high-income countries of the world, total of 3 billion people. For that group of globalizers, per capita GDP rose 5% per year in the 1990s. Group two was non-globalizers. And for non-globalizers, the ratio of exports to GDP declined in the 1980s and 1990s. This would include much of Africa, it would include the Middle East, it would include Russia. For that group, per capita GDP declined an average of 1% per year in the 1990s. However, when you think about trade and growth, international trade is only one of many factors that contribute to economic growth, and it probably isn't the most important factor. Other key factors might include education, investment, new technology, and a good rule of law that supports market institutions. What I'm trying to say here is a country with poor education and low investment and high corruption and no rule of law is not going to save its economy by saying, well, let's expand international trade. Expanding international trade does help economic growth, and in a significant way. But when you're making the case for free trade, it's important not to present it as some sort of cure-all for everything that goes wrong. I mean, if you asked me what's important for helping a nation grow, I'd list lots of factors. I might start with education and healthcare for the population, physical infrastructure, water, electricity, telecommunications, keeping inflation low, a lack of corruption, laws about competition, a well-regulated financial and banking system, flows of information and ideas. And in this mix, I would add in globalization and foreign trade, but it's not obviously the king of the list. Moreover, the gains from globalization are real, but they aren't free. Gains from globalization are the result of restructuring industries, relying on suppliers from other countries, and orienting your economy toward the global economy. So, I think the gains from trade are real. I also think that it's important not to overstate them and present them as some magic cure-all for what ails the economies of the world. Ultimately, how close is the world to a borderless market? How far has globalization actually gone? When people talk about globalization and trade, they often talk about what they call a borderless world, where goods and money zoom back and forth as if borders don't really exist. How close is the world economy to a world where, from an economic point of view, national borders don't matter? And the perhaps surprising answer is that even in the early 21st century, national borders still seem to matter a heck of a lot. And let me offer some of the evidence. One measure of trying to think about whether borders matter is to compare trade between metropolitan areas or states or regions that are a certain size in terms of their economy and a certain distance apart. And you might compare two of those regions within one country, like say the states of Illinois and Washington State, and you might compare within Canada, say Ontario and British Columbia. And then you would say, okay, let's look at trade going between those two within the countries, and then let's look at the crisscross trade going across the national border. Now, if borders don't matter, then the trade going back and forth across the national borders should be more or less the same as the trade within the countries, because the national border doesn't matter. And of course, for any two examples, this might not be true, but if you look at a bunch of examples together, you should be able to see a pattern there. When you do that kind of a study, you find that actually the effect of national borders is large. There was a study a few years ago that compared trade between provinces of Canada and states of the United States, and it found out that after you adjust for distance and the size of the local economies, Canadian provinces trade maybe 12 to 20 times as much with each other as they do with comparable U.S. states. If you look across OECD countries, the sort of rich, high-income countries of the world, trade within the country is often 3 to 10 times as high between the regions of the country as trade across borders. Now, these estimates are often being recalculated using different methods. I wouldn't want you to hang your hat on one certain number, but overall it seems clear that the national border really does matters a lot. Another test of a borderless world. Do things cost pretty much the same if you cross from one country into another country? I mean, think about some tradable good that's common across markets like color televisions or cars or blue jeans. These are going to cost pretty much the same if you look at, say, Minneapolis and Chicago and St. Louis. But if you cross national borders, do they still cost the same? And in fact, prices are extremely different across national borders. There are a lot of detailed surveys on this point. And perhaps the easiest way to see the point is to look at what happens when exchange rates shift. After all, if prices are going to be the same across national borders, then when the exchange rate moves, then the prices should move just as much. But it turns out that only about half of changes in the exchange rate filter through to prices in different markets. So if you're comparing in different countries, this sort of movement in exchange rates, this comparison between prices, is happening all the time. And prices are not changing in lockstep between the US and Japan, or Japan and Canada, or the US and the UK. Why do national borders matter? I mean, what's the difficulty? We think of ourselves in this globalized economy. The reasons would be things like transportation and communication networks are usually developed within a country, with nations in mind. They aren't developed to help facilitate movements across national borders. Whenever you go across a national border, you have to deal with different legal and tax systems. You may have to deal with different languages and cultural issues. You may have different currencies, different rules about dealing with the labor force, different safety regulations, different accounting rules. There may also be explicit laws to limit imports one way or another. When you try and value all of these things and add them up, it can add up to an extra cost of 40% or so when goods cross national borders, which is really a significant boost in costs and would explain why things don't move across national borders all that easily. Now, this argument about the borderless world is just an argument about facts. I should say that if you're in favor of free trade or if you're opposed to free trade, this argument can cut either way. All I'm saying is that if you favor free trade, you should be really happy because there could be a whole lot more of it. If you're opposed to free trade, you should be worried because we can have a whole lot more of it. My point is that we are not yet close to a borderless world. You could see a lot more trade across borders in the future for a variety of reasons. For example, there are international trade agreements which could encourage trade across borders. Transportation costs keep falling and falling with new technology. And obviously information and communication costs keep falling and falling as well. And those things are all going to make it easier to coordinate trade back and forth across international borders. In the future, I expect this trend to globalization is not nearly over, but is actually going to still be continuing. The public discussion over free trade is often really a matter of labels. Labels can be highly controversial. In the dispute over abortion, for example, you have this pro-life and pro-choice label, so everybody can be pro-something. The equivalent in free trade is everyone needs to be for something, so everyone says, well, we're in favor of free trade, but some people add, as long as it's fair. Well, fairness. Fairness is one of these concepts that you may notice economists have had a hard time with. Fairness is in the eye of the beholder. In many cases, many situations, fairness is just a sweet-talking way of saying, I don't think we should import stuff from other countries. The arguments for limiting imports can be evaluated on their merits. That's the subject of the next lecture. But sort of saying it's just fair to do something is, in my mind, assuming what needs to be proven. When I hear someone talking about, I'm in favor of free trade as long as it's fair trade, I get suspicious that basically they're not in favor of free trade, and frankly, I'm usually right to be suspicious. I hope that this lecture has convinced you that support for free trade is at least not an irrational prejudice. There are real and important gains that are possible from free trade. But of course, the argument for free trade won't be complete until we consider all the possible costs and trade-offs and reasons that are given for limiting trade. And that's the task of the next lecture.